Our next poet, Leland Kinsey's 7th volume of poetry, Winter Ready, was published earlier this year. It is a collection drawn from his muse, the physical life and landscape of the Northeast Kingdom. Sally Pollock of the Burlington Free Press has noted of Leland, he writes about the stuff he knows, fixing a chimney, cutting corn, clearing a field, digging a garden, the work of rural families in the North Country. This, she writes, is the center of his physical universe, a fact not surprising as he was born and raised on a farm in the Northeast Kingdom, the land his Scottish ancestors settled in the early 1800s. Kinsey's other titles reflect his ability to tap the vital forces of Vermont's rural evolution from early settlement to the time of his own childhood memories. Among these are Family Drives, The Immigrant's Contract, and Sledding on Hospital Hill. He has worked, among many other things, as a farmhand, a printer, and a horse trainer. Embedded in farm life, his poetry, nonetheless, has a universal meaning and appeal. Reflecting this, his poems Dugouts, Surviving Bulls, and Yogurt have been read by Garrison Keillor on NPR's The Writer's Almanac. Generous with his time and expertise, Leland has conducted writing workshops for the Vermont Arts Council and the Children's Literacy Foundation at over 100 schools in New Hampshire and Vermont, taught courses at Elderhostel, and come a long way to be with us today. Please give a very warm Burlington Book Festival welcome to Leland Kinsey.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to read mostly from my new collection, Winter Ready, today. In the first one, the very first poem of the book is Pointing the Chimney. I'm not going to read that, but I refer to that in here, and probably most of you know, pointing is simply the process of replacing mortar that has come out. This one is titled Chimney Swifts. Pointing the chimney, I startled, almost off the roof. Upshot from the flue's mouth like shrapnel from a mortar, flew dozens of swifts, and flew higher like flinders from an exploding shell. Once the optical illusion of their alternate wing beats ceased, they soared, their tight cigar-like bodies and boomerang wings whirling in outside loops, Immelman turns, stalls, nosedives, hunting and eating on the fly. Then, since they cannot perch, ignoring me, they dove like dropped stones back down the flue's mouth, but en masse looked like smoke returning to where I could not see them in the dark well. I could hear the scratching of their small claws and bristly, bracing tails, the small sound and tiny echo of their twittering calls. I have sometimes found a nestling in the ashes, fallen, and no way to replace it. But these were post-breeders in some numbers, colonizing my creosote-stained, coal-spalled chimney that I'm trying to keep standing. The birds will migrate soon from this narrow room, this edifice I serve, which serves us well. I'll clean the hard and ashy residues of last year's fires. The stiff brushes for this work will also scrape away the few spit and twig crescents that, like fragile boats, floated their seasonal small white egg and nestling cargo over depths the living never plumbed. In the next one, I use the word fungo, and again, probably most of you know that fungo is simply the tossing up of a ball and hitting it out to your person playing with you. Playing fungo. My grown son asked to go out and have me hit a few before first snow. I lay down hard grounders and shout, "Good, stop!" His way of staying connected to his youth, not distant, and me. I remember a time I could swing the bat with ease, no hitch in the hips, back muscles wouldn't seize. The days stretched long for my brother and me in sharp stubble fields. As we got so good, we were so far apart we could hardly talk. Or with the few neighbor kids for inning after uncounted inning. Grass wore out and stained, dirt scrapes, close calls, self-called, gave one a sense of winning even when the score was lopsided, as were the poorly made balls when ash and hide cracked for hit, foul, or out. When horsehide and cowhide collided on pitches or plays in the field, the odor of leather and the neat's foot oil we rubbed into the gloves all winter rose like a mist. Rose like the mist from warm ground late evenings that you could lose your ball in when you couldn't decide how to yield. Or like the heavier fog burning off fall mornings when the season and season were ending and our longest throws and deepest drives had rhythm and no reason. Many of the poems in this book, Winter Ready, concern the work to prepare for getting ready for winter. Just as a side note, this photograph of this rather shotgun-shattered Christ I took about 35 years ago with my grandmother's bellows camera that she was given in 1916. When the publisher asked me if I had an idea for the cover, I said, yes, I do. Anyway, this one is titled Double Digging the Garden. The first shovel depth turns easily, a fine-built loam of native soil, and the manure, leaves and wood stove cinders, garden debris, kitchen garbage that heat of their own accord at the middle of the compost pile and burn to a fine gray ash, which I forked steaming in the late fall air into the wheelbarrow to spread on the plot before I began my tilth. I build a berm as I spade the first trench. The second shovel depth is hard to turn, a remnant of the glacial till pushed by ice and dropped as heavy sediment in the great plowing of this region. But I want some clay in my topsoil and a deeper richness in the bed to hold water and nourish in summer drought. I want crops like my uncle's field corn that once stood 14 foot, French white radishes like baseballs, enough cucumbers for 4 kinds of pickles plus relish, tomatoes for sauce, juice, piccalilli, and eating out of hand, lettuces like thick knots making up a variegated carpet in hues from greens to reds. My wife and I have way too much of all of this. Our children gone, pets large and small, which used to consume the extra, have long since died. I squeeze, can, freeze, dry. My grandmother had jars of raspberries dated a decade old, and I soon may match that mark with my supplies. I give much away, will have to give more, to extended family, neighbors, food banks. I could join the farmer's market, but don't like meeting new people. My legacy may consist of refuse. By the turn of mid-afternoon, my spine feels bent and raised like the spade's frog. For 2 brisk days, heated by work, I fill the ditch just dug with the diggings of the new, all the way down to the end of my tillage, then barrow the levee at the start, down to fill the last. The soil lies loose, aerated, and free of any rocks the deep frost forced up. It will drain and open easily in spring for cold, hardy crops, and warm quickly for fainter seeds. Each summer I bring friends out to note and share the display and produce. Here is life's habit on grand exhibit and the hard work hidden. I would like to just commend to you this book, which is at the Green Mountain Writers Press. This is a book, a collection of poems and photographs titled So Little Time, Words and Images for World and Climate Crisis. And the profits from this go to the 350 organization, which has helped organize the large march which is taking place as we speak down in New York City. And so the two poems I have in here also are in my book, but I thought I'd just read out of here to make note of that fact. Fall light. The light in my dining room turns golden for 2 weeks each fall. I sit, read, and write in that room at that time of year. A north-facing room, usually slightly blue in tone, even when the sun comes in under the porch roof and through the side window early mornings. The tree's color does not rivet one, not the deep reds, various oranges, or the purples of the most striking trees, or especially those with variegated leaves, but draws attention nonetheless. For a time, the tree stands stately yellow, like the sun at height, if you could look at it, and that is the light the tree reflects and diffuses into my room through the huge leaded picture window the original house wrights thought to put looking out on the town thoroughfare. The sun, in its southern sphere now, hits the tree full on. Nothing much going on in the street beyond the hedge, this quiet part of the world's bustle, now in the tall maple's shadow. But in here, illumination a painter might die for, a photographer would use filters to achieve, and which in cinema would be memory itself. The several million leaves, unnoticed each by each, fall after they shine and fade like individual frames in this part of the movie we call days, till the last one passes from the light into the rolling dark. I think I'll just read a couple more. You've been very good to stay and listen to all of us. This one is titled Threatening Winter, and it alludes to the fact that if nuclear war had ever happened, it would have been a nuclear winter. But it just hints at that. Threatening winter. When I was a boy, a jet fighter fell out of the sky less than a mile from home. The pilot flew because of warnings from Thule in the long cold that threatened a winter we did not even know about. When the engine was stricken and failed, the pilot bailed and parachuted into an elderly couple's pasture. He showed up at their door, badly burned. They drove him to the local hospital in their Lark. He told the couple his name, but asked them not to tell. They didn't know if from shame or secrecy. The Air Force, who came in great trucks with heavy equipment to excavate the crater, announced in local radio spots that all souvenirs must be returned. So our school bus, a woman's station wagon hired by the town, stopped one morning so an 8th grade boy could toss a car trunk-sized piece of aluminum fuselage skin we'd been sitting tightly with onto the truck bed, already piled with landing gear, wingtips, ailerons, unrecognizable fragments, and a muddy canopy from a neighbor's barnyard, where it had struck but not killed his best bull. Luck of some sort. Another boy's parents made him return a machine gun barrel, but he kept a few rounds. He'd used to ride his St. Bernard to school, would sick him on us, one girl badly chewed. The town selectman had the dog put down, buried him up in my uncle's field for some reason. Boy said he was going to get a functioning gun and deal with those who'd cost him his dog. My family had been drawn out that night by an odd whine we couldn't locate until we saw the flash rise beside the road to a nearby pond. The lower sky turned red, like when our upper neighbor's house and barn burned, or like when my grandparents' house and barn burned, or when our lower neighbor's barn burned, or how it might have looked out my own window if I'd risen to watch our barn burn. But the flash was followed seconds later by a clap that would have put an end to thunder, and, as with lightning, we could estimate the distance and begin to walk the road toward it. Rockets were part of the armament, we later learned, and local men brought back examples they'd collected, as the Air Force gleaned as much as it could before hard winter set in. Snow soon covered the crater. The pilot almost fully recovered. We recovered bolts and pieces of skin and frame for years as we hunted or fished in the area where we hoped it likely nothing else would fall. Excuse me. Picking stone for Jeff. 15 acres of upturned soil, heavily scattered, I'm going to interrupt myself. I do mention in here carbonaceous chondrites, and that's simply one kind of meteor that can fall. Just picking stone for Jeff. 15 acres of upturned soil, heavily scattered with stones, that my cousin plowed to plant this fall before his diagnosis of cancer kept him from the necessary clearing, lay before us. I and other family volunteered for a farm's worst work, to scrabble over that tillage, picking the rocks from fist size to those too heavy to lift, so planting and reaping machinery could survive. We would too, but faced a hot south wind that dried the clay soil to dust and swirled it into devils that clogged our noses and coated our tongues and throats. We could not drink enough and knew the next day we would know the all-body ache that dry, hard work makes. Gloves could partly protect fingers and palms from sharp edges and pinches and raps between stones. Those we couldn't lift, we slid onto the stone boats and lugged plenty almost too big to make our loads. Dumped at a field edge embankment that began to look like an abandoned weather-dumped wall, made of stone, barely stone, like shale and mudstone, through those forms laid down, sunk and melted, to that from the mantle, long cooled and heavy as the day. I also knew some one of us likely picked a rock from the moon or Mars, or a leftover bit from the solar system's swirling creation, some stony meteorite or carbonaceous chondrite that likely bore water and acids as precursors to life. One might notice the black surface, pitted nature, or peculiar weight, and still not recognize what one had in hand. No ceremony then or now, work bracketed by beginnings and endings. My cousin is well enough to plant the field for spring cropping next spring, but he will not live to cut it for green chop, and knows it. If only we could reverse it, the burning up to falling dust. Last winter, wild turkeys came out of the woods regularly to feed in his bunker silo. He poached several, said it seemed fair, he and the flock providing each other easy meals. They don't need to pick grit for their gizzards to grind silage, and the meat so tender. He hopes to invite us to such a meal this early winter. As I left, he acknowledged my father's past push to extend tillage on upland hardscrabble, while my uncle's land laid that much closer to the good soil laid down in the beds of Ice Age lakes. Well, I know you must love me. I never thought I'd see you pick stone again. Little enough burden. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. Good afternoon.